I'm Mez, I'm an Android developer. I'm really interested in Kotlin and really interested in its applications. This is a talk about how I struggled to get into Kotlin and some of the things I had to learn the hard way before I had my aha moment. That's how you actually do it. My first big gotcha is that if you're really nervous like I am and this is your first talk of this size, don't down a couple of drinks and have to rush to the toilet. It's really, really bad. Okay, so how I approach Kotlin. I approach Kotlin by trying to convert a couple of apps. So the first app that I try to convert is one built by Andy at the back. It is an app that helps him drink beer, I think, and it has a nice animation in it, and it was written in Java, and it's released as a library, and it has a sample app with it. So I converted the library, and I converted the app afterwards, had a bit of to and fro with Andy in a PR, and then once we're happy, we're happy. I mainly started off by using the Kotlin converter, and the Kotlin converter is great, and it went really straightforward to begin with. However, what I found difficult was that even when I did use a Kotlin converter, I was just getting stuff that was Kotlin that still looked like Java, and it worked, but it didn't really look idiomatic Kotlin. And I struggled with that quite a lot to begin with. A lot of it was because of my misunderstandings of Kotlin, and a lot of it was because I was still trying to write Java, and I wasn't trying to write Kotlin. Yes, it would run in Kotlin, but it wasn't Kotlin. So I was still trying to do Java patterns in Kotlin. For example, one of the ways in which the little refresh works in that thing there is that we null an object, I think that's correct, in the old Java library. And I was convinced in my head that, Kotlin, you don't use nulls, get rid of nulls, and everything is non-nullable, and everything is a val. But then you can't null the object, and you can't restart the timer. So I struggled with that a lot, and I think it was more of a conceptual struggle, but it took me a while to get my head around it, that, okay, it's all right, and there are ways to do these, but my first gotcha was that don't think that Kotlin will just completely magically make your nulls go away. You still have to work around them. Yep, so the second app that I converted was a non-Android app, and it was an app that I built that took politicians' tweets and converted them into plain English, or jive talk, as I like to call it. So here's Jeremy Corbyn's, one of his latest tweets, and at the top is him making sense, speaking in jive. So it's a Spring Boot application. So it's not an Android application, but Kotlin has actually really great support outside of Android. Anywhere that Java runs, Kotlin can run as well. And Spring Boot and Spring have got really good support for it. So I do a lot of text processing in this Spring Boot application, and I make a few API calls as well. So that was really, really easy to do in Kotlin. I found that a lot nicer to write and nicer to read. The files were, as the marketing spiel goes, a lot more concise to write and read. However, I ran into a few difficulties. The difficulties were largely around annotation processing and largely around the testing. So I thought naively that I could just one-on-one swap out my Java for Kotlin, rewrite it a bit, and everything would work. And yeah, it sort of did, and it sort of didn't. So I'm going to speak a bit about the Kotlin converter. So this is great if you ever want to start converting your Java classes. This is clearly the way to go. It's really, really, really good. However, it does have a few gotchas. At the top, if you're an Android developer, you'll recognize the onActivity result. You start an activity, you do something, you end it, and you get a result, happy, pass, fail, whatever. So at the top is the Java, at the bottom is just the automatic convert from Kotlin. Can anyone spot where the error is? It's quite subtle. It's over here in the intent. That should be nullable. And if you're not looking out for that, if you don't know it should be nullable, then oh yeah, the converter works. Yeah, there's no double exclamation marks. Everything is great until you run it, until you get a runtime crash. So a couple of things to look out for is, yep, the converter's great, and yep, that works 80–90% of the time, but don't think it works all the time. So as ever, test your app 160 times before you actually want to release it. What is really, really frustrating is that this would have been solved if it was one of your own classes by just properly annotating the source Java. And had the intent data at the top been annotated as nullable, then the converter would have said, yeah, that's fine, I'll put a little question mark next to the data intent at the bottom in Kotlin. It's really frustrating that this is Google's code, so you can't really annotate that unless there's some fancy tricks that will tell me at the pub where you can. But that's one thing to look out for. But again, if you're being sensible and you're not just converting and pushing out to live, then you probably will catch stuff like this, so test. So here's an example of what I mean. On the left is some Java code, on the right is it converted into Kotlin. So if you give it the information, if you give the Kotlin converter the information that it needs, then it's really, really good at converting. So by that I mean stuff like in Java, annotating with the final keyword. Obviously the annotations nullable, non-null, they're really, really good. But also if you give it hints and you say that my field has a couple of guessers and setters, then when it converts, it knows to convert it properly to a property in Kotlin. So all of those things work really, really well if your Java is written in kind of a modern Java-y way. If your Java is like, it works Java, then you might have problems. And it's very, very easy to write, it just works Java. Because after all, that's how Java was so popular, it just works, doesn't it? So one of the other things that I struggled a lot with was how to create classes. And again, this comes back to, it's very, very easy to do it in Java without paying a lot of attention to really what you're doing. And if you're forced to pay attention about what properties you want, how your class is to be constructed, maybe even default values, then that really, really helps. It helps because the Kotlin compiler enforces these things for you and your app will just not build. But as frustrating as it was to start with, one of the gotchas I had was thinking, hang on, this should be accelerating my development. I should be whipping out apps like nobody's business in Kotlin, but I wasn't. It was, at least initially, going very, very slowly. And that's fine. I'm happy with that now because the code that we do right now is a lot safer. You know, I've got a lot more confidence in the code. I don't have to keep a lot of it in my head. I don't have to think, oh, what if this happens under these conditions? I can enforce a lot of it at compile time, and that's a good thing. So I guess the takeaway on that is, if it goes a bit slower to begin with, that's fine. You know, that's okay to be like that. So the annotation processing I touched on briefly as well. With Kotlin, you can simply swap out your Gradle annotation processing with something called CAT, Kotlin Annotation Processor, and everything works until it doesn't work. So I found this out when I was trying to, maybe incorrectly, but I was trying to use Autofactory and Dagger, and it was all messing up for me, and it worked, and then it didn't work, and it turned out that what I've done is I've generated a bunch of files, converted, and then cleaned my project. Then all those generated files disappeared, and when I tried to rebuild, it didn't work. And I got this really, really obtuse error. And it basically relied on something to do with precise types. I don't even understand it myself now, but it took me hours and hours, late nights, trying to figure out what was going on. So the one gotcha here is don't rush into doing these things. Read the bloody documentation. It does tell you right there that if you use annotation processes and you come across this error, then there's a little quick fix there for you. Put that in your build-up Gradle, and yes, it did magically work. So I felt a bit silly having spent all that time when the answer was right there in front of me. But when you're eager to do something, you just kind of want to do it. So that's another tip gotcha for you. And then the last one from me is unit testing. So from the Spring Boot project, the Jive bots, I had a bunch of unit tests that I made heavy use of Mockito for. The way Mockito works is it will try and subclass your class that you want to mock out such that it can override and give behaviours to methods. But that only works if you can actually subclass your class. And in Kotlin, by default, unless you provide an open keyword, all your classes are closed by default, which is equivalent to the final keyword in Java. You can't subclass those files. Your Mockito tests just break. And again, there's a really obtuse error about it, and there's a lot of Googling around it. But thankfully, if you add some magic, I call this not the mock maker, but just the magic maker in Mockito. Again, it's all documented, but it will, I don't know what it does. I think it does some byte twiddling under the covers, but it will make your tests work again. So if you're frustrated that I've converted and now I've got a lovely Kotlin app, but my tests are broken, what do I do? Then all is not lost. You can implement an ugly but a fairly simple solution, and it should work. So that's it. All of this came about from me joining initially Kotlin Nights as part of SWmobile. So if anyone is interested in Kotlin or wants to learn more or wants to convert other apps, I've got tons that I haven't yet converted. Please help others. Elliot's written a lovely blog post, there he is, this month about one of his Kotlin Nights Meetups. So please check out the website, please come visit us and talk about Kotlin. Thank you.